It is the richest nation per capita in all of Africa, and it's a nation where 3 in every 4 people still live in abject poverty. It's a land ruled not by the same party, but by the same man for nearly half a century. And it's a nation that spent years under the extreme personality cult of a deranged dictator who oversaw the demise of up to a quarter of his own people, only for those who survived to realize that the next guy, well, he was even worse. The nation in question is Equatorial Guinea, a tiny country that most people around the world couldn't even place on a map, even though part of its location is in its name. Known in part for its incredible oil reserves and in part for its incredibly bad human rights record, Equatorial Guinea is a place where life bears little resemblance to most places on Earth. Its history makes that of most nations read like a child's storybook. Its rulers make the North Korean Kim dynasty look like jolly old uncles, and the torment its people are subjected to would make life in most of the world's least fun places look like a field day. On today's episode of Places, well, buckle up, because we're headed to Equatorial Guinea, the most exploited nation on Earth. Now, usually, when talking about some far-flung corner of the world on this channel, we'd start by winding back the clock and tracing its human evolution from prehistory to the modern day. However, we're going to make a little diversion in this particular episode and enjoy a few sweet, cherished minutes talking about the place itself. Why, you ask? Well, because as soon as we start bringing people into the mix, all of this stuff is going to get pretty dark. So, Equatorial Guinea, a tiny patch of land nestled into the crook of the African continent. Equatorial Guinea shares land borders with only 2 other nations, Cameroon to the north and Gabon to the south and east. Its coastal nation laying claim to the small island of Bioko just off the coast, as well as 4 other smaller islands. Oddly, for a nation situated mostly on a single continental landmass, Equatorial Guinea's capital is located on the island of Bioko, which is just about the same size as the Hawaiian island of Maui. And despite its name, Equatorial Guinea is not quite equatorial. The global equator actually cuts a little bit south of their border through Gabon, but the name seems to have stuck anyway, and just for posterity, one single 17 square kilometer island claimed by Equatorial Guinea does happen to be south of the equatorial divide, so there's that. Look at the land itself, and Equatorial Guinea has all of the makings of a tropical paradise. The portion of the African continent that's blanketed by lush rainforests with mangrove colonies settled in long stretches across the coast. Several major continental rivers wind through the territory, flowing down from inland regions of the Congo, and the warm, wet landscape is practically overrun in most parts with vegetation. The coastal waters are shallow, so shallow in fact that during the 20-mile sail from the continent to the island of Bioko, the water's depth never drops past 60 meters. Bioko itself is a volcanic, mountainous island with its highest mountain, Pico Basile, stretching nearly 10,000 feet, that's 3 kilometers into the sky. On the small island of Annobon, that tiny patch of land south of the equator that we just mentioned a moment ago, local officials have never once registered a cloudless day in the island's entire recorded history. Biologically, Equatorial Guinea is incredibly diverse, with over 3,000 species of plant and hundreds upon hundreds of species of animals. Among their number are lowland gorilla and chimpanzees, hippopotamus, and abundant leopards and crocodiles, along with a range of monkey species, from mandrills to bush babies to the mustached monkey, which yes does look as silly as it sounds. The country hosts some of the last remaining colonies of the critically endangered African forest elephant, the smallest of the 3 living species of the elephant around the world, and the similarly endangered Pennant's colobus monkey and Prusa's monkey. Sadly, the story of Equatorial Guinea's natural landscape mirrors its human history, one with incredible potential and promise that's nonetheless been stripped away by a long line of decisions made by the small handful of people there with any measure of authority. The inland territory has been ravaged by deforestation, and the surviving ecosystem that does exist now relies on populations of walnut, mahogany, and other lucrative woods that have long since pushed out the native species. The country's mammals, especially its primates, are valued far more for their bushmeat than their biodiversity, and when looking at the list of countries that have taken steps to protect their native flora and fauna, Equatorial Guinea is usually conspicuously absent. And when it comes to the nation's human geography, it's best to start with the island of Bioko. It's home to just under 350,000 people, a sizable portion of the nation's total of 1.6 million, with most of those 350,000 living in the capital city of Malabo. Like the rest of the country, Spanish is the primary official language, although Portuguese and French are official languages as well, and a range of local languages and dialects are spoken across the country. On the continent, the people of Equatorial Guinea are predominantly Fang, as is the ruling government, although smaller ethnic groups are common, especially in small enclaves and settled pockets along the continental coast. By and large, the population is Christian, with a small Islamic population and some communities still practicing more traditional faiths. In Equatorial Guinea, you drive on the right, you use the calling code +240 and end your URLs in .gq. And well, that, unfortunately, is where the innocuous fun fact portion of today's episode comes to an end, because it's about to get miserable. The human history of Equatorial Guinea does, no doubt, go back millennia, but like so many parts of the world, its recorded history doesn't stretch nearly so far. Archaeological estimates suggest that the continental land now known as Equatorial Guinea was first settled by the ancestors of its current population at least 2,500 years ago, and possibly a good bit earlier than that. On Bioko Island, that history stretches back around 1,500 years. But the land's known written history starts in the year 1472 with the arrival on Bioko Island of Ferdinand Po. Portuguese explorer, Po was primarily known for his time on and around the islands in this part of Africa, and while he initially tried to call the island Formosa, the same name as the one originally given to modern-day Taiwan, the African nation was, before long, given the name of its discoverer. So, as to not get confused between Fernando Po the guy and Fernando Po the island, we'll continue referring to the island under its modern name of Bioko, but we trust that you'll forgive us on this one. Bioko and the nearby smaller island of Annobon were rapidly colonized by Portugal, who found their volcanic, nutrient-rich soils and their relative lack of deadly disease promising enough to start work toward building plantations and exploiting the natural resources there. However, that move ended up coming with two key problems. Firstly, just because the diseases on the islands weren't terribly fatal, that didn't mean that getting sick there wouldn't royally suck, which by all accounts it absolutely did. Second, there were locals on the islands, and they had zero interest in making life easy for the Portuguese. The settler population would leave the islands by the mid-1500s, and for the most part, they wouldn't come back for 2 more centuries. That all changed in 1778 when Bioko and Annobon were ceded from Portugal to Spain, along with a significant portion of mainland Africa. Spain's time spent with the islands seemed almost cursed from the very outset. The first governor who had been intended to take possession of the islands died almost as soon as he got there, and their crew would first mutiny and then try to reach nearby Sao Tome, with the few survivors by that time being imprisoned. But while Spain wouldn't make any meaningful investments into transforming the islands into a plantation territory, like the Portuguese had attempted to do, they'd instead put it to a different use: the slave trade. Over the following decades, Bioko would become an epicenter for the slave trade in sub-Saharan Africa, operating as a waypoint for shipments of enslaved individuals and as a base for slave traders to maintain in order to launch forays and expeditions into mainland Africa. Eventually, Spain would officially abolish slavery, but the trade would continue nonetheless for years afterwards, with Bioko remaining a central element. In 1827, Britain leased a naval base there, which it then used to suppress the continuing transatlantic slave trade without Spanish permission. The British, while based on the island, would interfere with the shipment of slaves to the New World for the better part of 2 decades. But by then, Britain's lease of a naval base on Bioko was more valuable to Spain than anything else happening on the island. Even centuries after its discovery, nobody had gone so far as to really invest in converting it to a profit center, and it would be largely ignored through the late 1800s. A few private plantations did exist on the island, mostly run by an elite black community called Ferdinandinos, who accepted large numbers of freed slaves on the island over the course of a few decades. By the latter years of the 19th century, Bioko was a bit of a melting pot, with African populations from as far south as Angola and as far north as Nigeria and Liberia, plus international communities from Cuba, the Philippines, and the Jewish diaspora, some of whom were in Africa as punishment for crimes committed elsewhere. Most Spaniards and other Europeans living there didn't particularly enjoy the ordeal. As English ethnographer Mary Kinsley put it, the island was, quote, a more comfortable form of execution. However, the people there were generally able to make do nonetheless, getting by with pidgin English and positioning themselves as intermediaries between Europe and the many people of the African continent. By the year 1900, France was pushing hard to expand across the African continent, while Spain, stretched thin between wars across the world and their waning place on the European stage, was forced to accept a treaty in which France ate away most of the continental territory in Africa that Spain had previously considered itself to own. What was left was seen in Spain as an embarrassment, a 26,000 square kilometer consolation prize that would, for the next few decades, be known as Spanish Guinea. Just to give an idea of how massive a black eye this was seen as, in Spain, the head of the team that negotiated this settlement for Spain chose to commit suicide rather than return home. But for the Spaniards, who now chose to take advantage of Spain's small holdings on the African mainland, opportunity abounded for exploitation. Wealthy Spaniards carved out large sections of the territory for use in their own plantations, and during the 1910s and 1920s, cheap labor from Liberia streamed into Spanish Guinea at a constant clip. Liberia, around this time, was the sort of place where presidents could be elected with, say, 15 times more votes than there were voters during a given election, and no, we're really not making that up or exaggerating, that's what happens. By the time the Liberian public learned just how dire the situation was for their countrymen who'd chosen to travel to Spanish Guinea, the damage was already done. For decades, Liberians who had been intimidated and functionally enslaved into forced labor in Spanish Guinea were compelled to remain. Even then, they couldn't make up for the labor shortages Spanish plantations were facing, brought on by the repercussions of European disease and alcohol addiction ravaging Spanish Guinea's indigenous population. Well aware of the effect of the Spaniards on their people, many of Spanish Guinea's ethnic groups refused to work for Spain, growing their own cocoa instead and getting by as best they could. Eventually, the island of Bioko and the continental territory of Spanish Guinea, known both then and now as Rio Muni, were unified into a single country. By then, Liberian laborers had been supplanted with refugees from Cameroon and cheap contractors from Nigeria. The ethnic Fang population in the area was slowly subdued via a few years of military campaigns, and eventually they were forced into work as well. By the mid-1930s, a small anti-Spanish movement in the territory had been squashed under the new fascist regime of Francisco Franco, and with Franco's increased focus on productivity in Africa, claim a slow evolution of both the mainland territory and the islands into some of the more agriculturally efficient places on the continent, even compared to the territorial holdings of other European nations. It would continue as such through the World War II years, largely immune from the carnage wrought across the rest of the globe. After the war's conclusion, Spanish Guinea was wrapped up into the larger decolonization effort going on across Africa at that time. There were no major independence movements in this particular colony, no real political organization to rival the rule of the Spanish government, and if Spain had been inclined to maintain its hold on the territory, it likely could have done so for a very long time. But times were changing all across the world, and rather than continue to keep an indigenous African population under its thumb long after the other European powers had stopped doing so, Spain decided to get with the program and prepare their colony for its eventual independence. In hindsight, and with a full history of Equatorial Guinea in view, it's these few short years that were the bright spot for the territory, a tiny little gap between centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of tyrannical self-rule. In the years prior to independence in 1968, Spain poured resources into the colony, building an international airport, television infrastructure, hospitals, and even the beginnings of an intellectual culture via new higher education institutes. Literacy jumped to nearly 90%. Rates of leprosy and other major illnesses plummeted, and both Spain and the territory itself were presented with a fascinating finding that when you invest in the economic and humanitarian benefit of a region, things can actually get better there. It's shocking, we know. By 1965, Spain had been ordered by the UN to grant Spanish Guinea its independence, and a year later, Spain announced that it would hold a constitutional convention. The new nation would be called Equatorial Guinea, and its fate would be decided by a battle between two internal factions, with Spanish delegates presiding over the debate. On one side was Equatorial Guinea's dominant ethnic majority, the Fang, who made up a vast proportion of the continental population and a very high proportion of the Equato-Guinean population overall. On the other side were the people who lived on Bioko Island, including both smaller ethnic minorities and the ruling class of black elites who'd held power there for centuries. The residents on the island quite badly wanted their island to be independent from the continental nation. The residents of the continent, though, they wanted the whole thing. But the continental population had one asset that the islanders didn't, an asset and a person who would eventually divide Equatorial Guinea into the time before his madness wrought havoc across the nation and the time after. His name, Francisco Macias Nguema. Now, in Spanish Guinea's pre-independence days, Macias was generally seen as a sane, stable individual, which really is never a good thing to have as a preface for a historical figure, but here we are. Macias had grown up the son of Gabonese exiles living in the jungles of Spanish Guinea before they'd come under the direct control of the Spaniards. Part of the ethnic Fang majority in the area, Macias had one of those early lives that really sets the table for the person he would become. He survived tuberculosis more times than any person should have to. His witch doctor father is believed to have killed Macias' younger brother as a ritual sacrifice, and he grew up bullied and ostracized as a teenager because of his work as a servant for wealthy Spaniards. By 1968, he developed a paralyzing fear of death, a raging inferiority complex, and a drinking habit not for normal alcohol, but for a drink that makes people hallucinate really hard, and a whole lot of connections within Spanish Guinea after having worked his way up through the local bureaucracy in a wide range of government roles. Those roles included working as a court interpreter, where he was known for his tendency to take bribes from various sources and translate the testimony of criminal defendants however they asked him to. When 1967 rolled around, Macias found himself at the head of the Fang majority negotiating delegation, and that was going to be a problem for just about everybody involved. By then, Macias had earned a name for himself in a few exceptionally interesting ways. In prior meetings on Equatorial Guinean independence, he'd claimed that Adolf Hitler had actually intended all along to liberate Africa from colonialism, but got a little bit mixed up and tried to conquer continental Europe by accident. He had decided that he, himself, was a so-called Hitlerian Marxist, which is not a thing, and he had proclaimed Hitler to be Africa's savior, even during constitutional negotiations for his new nation. However, he also ended up being a decently compelling speaker, and apparently nobody within the Fang majority seemed to have a problem with any of the other stuff about him. He went on a press tour to the UN and became the beneficiary of some broader thinking at the time in the international community, where groups who had been persecuted by European leaders, like the Fang, tended to be favored over groups like Spanish Guinea's ethnic minorities on the island of Bioko, who had significantly closer ties to the European elite. So, the Fang were going to win the dispute over whether Equatorial Guinea would become one territory or two, it would remain one, and Macias was going to be their guy. He decided to run for the presidency, hired a Spanish advisor who wrote an actual political platform for him, and went way deep into nationalism during his campaign. His many personal oddities were waved away or even taken as endearing by the public, and his campaign promises basically amounted to giving away free ponies, but somehow they seemed to work anyway. Also around the same time, Macias himself began to wonder whether he might be a little bit unstable, even seeking treatment in Spain prior to the election, but neither he nor anybody else seemed to think that his, shall we say, innovative relationship with reality should stand between him and the presidency. In Equatorial Guinea's first free and fair election, which was also, as it turns out, Equatorial Guinea's last free and fair election, Macias would defeat Spanish Guinea's now ex-prime minister, who would, quite wisely, get the hell out of Equatorial Guinea almost as soon as he lost the election. He'd be returned by force shortly after with the help of the Spanish government and ended up committing suicide or being executed, the sources can't agree, just about 6 months into Equatorial Guinea's history. The Macias era had arrived, and it was gonna suck real bad. Even in the early months of the Macias administration, the eccentricities of Equatorial Guinea's new dictator were on full display for the world to see. Like many new incumbents, Macias decided to hit the ground running, but in his view of the world, getting off to the right start had a lot less to do with careful policymaking and a whole lot more to do with retribution. We've already mentioned Macias' former political opponents, but he wasn't the only one. Macias quickly broke ties with the Catholic Church, previously a dominant influence in his young nation, and began to rail against the powers that be in Europe. This despite the fact that Equatorial Guinea didn't yet have a currency or a national bank of its own and still had to rely on the Spanish peseta to do business. And within half a year of his election to the presidency, Macias' dictatorship made the turn from bizarre to macabre. In March 1969, just 6 months after his swearing in, Macias saw to it that his foreign minister, a man named Atanasio Ndongo, was arrested on charges of treason. Not enough for Macias, the president then pushed Ndongo out of a window and had pictures taken of Ndongo as he died in the middle of a city street. His paranoia then turned toward the Spanish, who, for their part, certainly hadn't made the transition easy. They'd declined to honor the expectation that they would send money previously allotted for Spanish Guinea to the new independent nation, and in return, Macias decided that the constitution negotiated with Spanish involvement would no longer be honored either. Macias kicked off a particularly concerning tour of his own country, calling on his fellow Equatorial Guineans to attack their country's some 7,500 remaining Spanish citizens who were residing there, whilst issuing orders to his own internal security forces that the Spaniards have their weapons collected. Spain quickly reacted by evacuating its remaining citizens from the country, and for all intents and purposes, Macias was able to rid himself of the remaining international influences in his country who might have had any success at reining him in. From there, the repression really began, and the centerpiece of that repression was Malabo's Black Beach. Located within the city of Malabo, right on Bioko Island's otherwise stunning coastline, Black Beach was a relic of Spanish occupation. In its early days, it was used to contain common criminals, but under Macias, it took on all the political focus of a gulag and all the brutality of a Nazi death camp. In the following decades, and to this day, Black Beach has gained a reputation as one of, if not the most brutal prison in Africa, a place where torture and complete medical neglect are a matter of practice, starvation is common, and mass executions run like clockwork. Of all the horrific prisons on Earth where you'd hope never to end up, Black Beach is one of the worst even today. And in its heyday under Francisco Macias, it may well have been the worst place on Earth. Political prisoners began flooding into Black Beach after the Spanish left, in part because of Macias' own delusion that any person who could possibly find cause to advocate against his rules and his practices simply must be an agent of the Spaniards still trying to overthrow him. Then, the mass execution started. The first major execution in Equatorial Guinea took place on Christmas Eve 1969 at the National Football Stadium, that's soccer for Americans. There, 186 suspected dissidents were given a sham trial and executed en masse, while Welsh singer Mary Hopkins's hit 1968 song, Those Were the Days, blared over the stadium loudspeakers. Of the 186 executed, 150 were shot or hanged, and those were the lucky ones. The remaining 36 became some of the first in Equatorial Guinea's history to meet the sort of fate that would define the Macias dictatorship. First, they were made to dig their own graves. Then, they were buried up to their necks. And finally, they were left for swarms of red ants burrowing through the dirt to eat them alive over the course of days. With the tone now set for his administration, Macias got to work dismantling the few institutions that had any hope of keeping him in check. By decree, he repealed large sections of the national constitution and ordered that all powers previously held by the legislature, the judiciary, and his own ministerial officials were now concentrated in his hands and his alone. The act of insulting or offending the office of the presidency, as well as the presidential cabinet, was made punishable by decades-long prison sentences. The act of threatening the presidency or the government was made punishable by death. Within a couple of years, Macias had named himself president for life. He took a flamethrower to his country's minimal remaining relationship with Spain and instead took up with the Soviets. Once he did, he began a blackmail policy against them, making himself essential for weapons smuggling to support an insurgency in Angola, but threatening to disaffiliate from the Soviet Union whenever he began to feel that they hadn't cut him a check recently enough. He also granted the Soviets exclusive rights to offshore fishing in Equatorial Guinean waters and, by some historical accounts, accepted thousands of tons of low-quality and rotting fish as thanks. Internally, he began cracking down on ethnic minorities and conducted mass arrests in parts of the country where a majority of people had voted against him in 1968. The use of Spanish was actively punished, as was the use of other ethnic minority languages, while the use of the majority Fang ethnicity language was made mandatory. It's difficult to ascertain whether Macias's public policies were intentionally designed to turn Equatorial Guineans' fear into social control, or whether they simply reflected Macias's own paranoia and delusion, but whatever the case, he was remarkably effective at instilling a sense of terror that rapidly pushed his people toward compliance. Deeply nepotistic and willing to throw away considerable rewards for even the smallest perceived help, Macias was known for bestowing lavish rewards and cushy government jobs to ordinary civilians who helped him uncover the Spanish conspiracy he believed existed around him. Just as extreme were the punishments that awaited those accused, who Macias seemed to value so little that if a random civilian made a claim to him or made a claim that reached him, that somebody was involved with something nefarious, and the accused will have very little recourse to prevent their execution or a long stretch in prison. With minor offenses known to result in crushing disproportionate punishment, people took to self-censoring by necessity, getting rid of any books or texts that might incriminate them, disassociating from people they felt might one day be swept up in the regime's net, and generally trying very, very hard to stay on the good side of everybody around them, lest they rub their neighbor the wrong way and find themselves tossed out and into Black Beach. Speaking of that notorious death camp, it's about time that we introduce a new character in Equatorial Guinea's story, and one who's going to get very, very important as time goes on. And his name was Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. His relevance? Nephew of Francisco Macias. His station? Military government of the island of Bioko and Vice Minister of the Armed Forces. Obiang is going to be exceptionally important later in today's story, so make sure to remember that name. But in these early days, he was just one of a cabal among Macias' relatives and close associates. Obiang, and others like him, had come into their current stations with functionally zero qualifications, and so long as they remained on Macias' good side, they could operate with impunity. For Obiang, that meant the active participation in torture of prisoners at Black Beach. Not just by giving orders as the overseer of the islands, but by taking part personally in what many have since alleged was an incredibly sadistic treatment of the prisoners unlucky enough to meet him. Under Obiang's watch, sexual violence was used en masse against women imprisoned there, often in front of their husbands. Entire families would be imprisoned, including children, for the acts or the suspected acts of their relatives. His prisoners were kept packed in holding cells, forced to remain there, naked, and prevented from relieving themselves so as to cover the floors with urine and excrement. Every Saturday night, Obiang held what he referred to as his dances. Prisoners were taken out and forced to dance around a campfire, singing a song in praise of Macias until they were exhausted, at which point, when they inevitably stumbled, they'd be hit with an iron made red hot in the campfire. When sham courts went to the trouble of actually sentencing somebody to death, that death didn't come by the noose or the firing squad, it came by the club. In the same years that Obiang spent horrifically abusing his charges, his uncle Macias was reaching what would be the peak of his totalitarian control. In 1973, just under 5 years after winning the presidency, Macias granted himself truly absolute power in a referendum that his government alleged received 99% support among the national population. He booted out the few institutional organizations that still remained, including the UN, and built a powerful militia to exert even more authority in the countryside. His cult of personality, always significant, now went completely off the rails. In his own country, Macias was known as the National Miracle and used his place as National Miracle to lead a purge of Catholic priests. When it was time to set his sights on the intellectuals, he declared himself Grand Master of Science, Education, and Culture, and killed or exiled nearly every person with a decent education in his country. When that seemingly didn't feel like enough, he extended the killing to every person who wore glasses before outlawing private education entirely. In 1978, he even gave Equatorial Guinea's national motto a facelift, quoting, "There is no God other than Macias Nguema." The nation's finances he claimed for himself, killing the governor of Equatorial Guinea's central bank to get it, in cash, out of the coffers. His ministers and his puppet legislators in his parliament were executed en masse as he saw fit, and in the countryside his militias were empowered to destroy entire villages in order to catch dissidents if need be. When he wished to stop the workers at his country's main power plants from using lubricant oil on the machinery there, he claimed he would lubricate the machinery with magic. When the power plant inevitably exploded, he did nothing to repair it. In one last touch, he outlawed fishing and destroyed every non-government-operated boat his militias could find. After all, without boats, there was no way to flee his island. And on the African continent, he ensured that the only road out of his nation was saturated with landmines and spikes. Finally, there's one more feature of Macias' dictatorship that we've got to mention. His relationship with a similarly despotic tyrant who lived halfway around the world. When it came to strange bedfellows, Francisco Macias and North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung probably stand out, but Macias was an admirer of Kim, and according to Macias' own daughter, the two had a real friendship. Speaking of Macias' daughter, Monique, she, her mother, and her siblings had been sent to North Korea to live and study in 1979. But she'd end up remaining there for years, and then when her mother left North Korea and left her children behind, Monique and her siblings would be taken in by Kim Il-sung personally. Kim and the young Monique would maintain a close relationship, and she would live in Pyongyang under the Kim family's protection through 1994. Later in life, she's become a staunch defender of Kim Il-sung, but, well, that's definitely a discussion for another day. When charting the course of Macias' dictatorship across time, it begins to look less like a several-decade regime and more like a time bomb doomed to inevitable and incredibly destructive definition. By the late 1970s, even Macias himself seemed to know that something was up, and the tides of change that had buoyed his rise for so long were now starting to shift against him. By 1978, Macias had long since moved himself out of the capital to a private bunker in his home village attached to an ornate fortified villa. Also part of the compound was a prison kept well stocked with inmates who, on occasion, Macias would execute personally. More and more often, his former allies would be swept up in his purges. People who had no intention to turn against him suddenly found themselves under the excruciating heat ray of Macias's attention. The walls he'd put around Equatorial Guinea were now all but impenetrable. Western food, medicine, identities, and ideas were banned, and everyone outside of his own inner circle who might have had the training or knowledge to effect some sort of change were either long dead or long gone. His regime trained children as young as 7 for military service and shot their parents with impunity when they attempted to spare their children the ordeal. When brave statisticians attempted to measure how completely his economy had collapsed, they were imprisoned or executed, including one that Macias had dismembered in order to, in Macias's words, help him learn to count. Christianity was outlawed, Western clothes were outlawed, and Macias took direct control over the scant shipments of food his country received, withholding it from the public so that he could resell it at exorbitant prices and punish those who he didn't believe were willing to work. More often than not, the people who were starving were more than happy to work. They were simply poor, and Macias had lost his awareness of what it meant to be an ordinary person a very long time ago. And with all that, with his surviving enemies driven out, his population so thoroughly pacified and tormented that anywhere between 8 and 25% of the entire country is estimated to have been executed or starved, while Macias, he was running out of people to kill. Well over 100,000 more had fled, nearly half the national population according to the World Bank, although other estimates place that number as high as 70%. The nation he had built had been condemned as the so-called Dachau of Africa in reference to the Nazi concentration camp, and the moniker really did fit. But Macias had kept on without deteriorating, without treatment for his profound mental health struggles, without anybody in his country willing to speak plainly to him, and seemingly without the capacity to engage with them if they did. Macias was simply seen as a man rapidly devolving. His intense use of hallucinogenics had never slowed down, and his paranoia was far beyond anybody's control. Around his compound, he had taken to walking the grounds alone, repeating the names of people he'd killed and holding conversations with the dead. And in the summer of 1979, he committed perhaps the only act that would have turned his inner circle decisively against him. He arranged for several of his own family members to be executed, including one of the brothers of the man that we mentioned before, Macias's nephew, Teodoro Obiang. It was Obiang who led the August 1979 coup against his uncle, with the support of most of Macias's inner circle, the national military, and the Cuban guards of the Equatorial Guinean National Palace, as well as the tacit approval of Spain, the US, and other global observers. With Macias out in the countryside, the capital city was there for the take. And although Macias and his loyalists attempted to mount a defense when the coup plotters came to his compound, burning most of Equatorial Guinea's cash reserves while they waited, their defense did not last long. When it seemed as if Macias's power couldn't be won back, his loyalists turned tail and fled, leaving the mad dictator to disappear on his own into the jungles of continental Africa. 2 weeks after the coup began, he was found delirious near a car stuffed full of millions of US dollars in cash. He was arrested and taken to stand trial before a military tribunal alongside 10 mostly irrelevant members of his former government who were there mostly as show. Among Macias's charges, genocide, treason, mass murder. Macias would attempt to wiggle his way out of his fate more than once. When on the stand, he insisted that he had worked faithfully on behalf of his nation and done many good deeds, but the tribunal was unconvinced. Sentenced to a total of 101 death sentences, he swore over and over again that his ghost would enact revenge on any person who had aided in his condemnation. When the time came for Equatorial Guinea to organize a firing squad, that threat of retribution from the afterlife was enough to ensure that not a single Equatorial Guinean soldier would step up to be a part of the firing squad. Instead, Francisco Macias Nguema would be executed by firing squad at his own Black Beach prison by a squad of hired Moroccan troops who bore no concern for his curse. After a decade of tyrannical, totalitarian rule, the dictator was no more. By the time Macias was executed, the ruins of Equatorial Guinea hardly resembled a nation at all. Life expectancy in his nation had dropped to just 30 years old. Infant mortality was well over 50%, and nearly half of Equatorial Guineans had been taken into state custody at least once over the course of the last decade, or could at least name one relative who had been killed. No fewer than 8% of the entire national population had died under his rule, and some estimates were several times that. And all this taken as rough snapshots from the outside as international observers tried desperately for years to peer through the veil and ascertain just how terrible things had become in Equatorial Guinea. In another life, Teodoro Obiang might have been the person who turned this all around, not because there seemed to be any shred of compassion or decency in a man who'd spent years delighting in the torture of his victims, but because he was going to be the ruler Equatorial Guinea got next, no matter how benevolent or tyrannical his rule might have become. Unfortunately for his nation, he very quickly dispensed with the benevolent option and chose the tyrannical one. In the early days, Obiang seemed to follow the example his uncle had set, making token changes to the constitution and the law so as to seem as if he were moderating his nation. And after a decade under Macias, even a new dictator was a welcome gift, even if he wasn't completely out of touch with reality, which it seemed Obiang wasn't. Sure, he functionally elected himself president in a vote that saw no opposition candidates allowed to participate. Sure, he would do the same thing again 7 years later, and sure, when he allowed opposition in his later elections, he ensured that he still got nearly 100% of the vote. But it wasn't nothing. And as patently obvious as it might have been, when coming into authority in a country where even Francisco Macias' inner circle was no longer able to feed themselves securely, that step one is to provide the stuff of basic subsistence to one's own citizens. And well, he did it. With Obiang in charge, the nation began to emerge from the cover of complete international silence. Spain, which had outlawed reporting on Equatorial Guinea while Macias was in charge, began to reference the country again in Spanish-language media. The Soviets, Cuba, China, and other communist-affiliated nations decided to take a more active approach in working with him and were more than happy to offer small amounts of funding that went a very long way in a country where they'd be used to provide a small population with what they needed to survive. The global West began putting out their own feelers, the UN began working toward collaborative efforts, and France even began to work to bring Equatorial Guinea under the umbrella of French West Africa. But the fact that the international community was taking to Obiang because he presented a better Equatorial Guinea than Macias did still misses the point in a pretty major way. Nothing about the nation's totalitarian hold on its people got any more lenient. None of the freedoms and rights so completely kept outside the reach of Equatorial Guineans were ever provided, and if anything, Obiang proved to be much more shrewd and a well-entrenched tyrant than Macias had ever been. And we simply must emphasize here that the nations of the world knew precisely what Obiang had been doing in his torture camps before Macias was deposed, a fact that we have to ask you keep in mind as we discuss how Obiang's relationship with the West has gotten closer and closer with time. The decade or two following Macias' ouster were ones when Equatorial Guinea developed something of a status quo. The most brutal excesses of the Macias years were put by the wayside in favor of the routine, everyday, almost bureaucratic repression that Obiang imposed. Mass murders and forced labor were replaced with mass imprisonments and exploited paid laborers. Those who committed unspeakable crimes under Obiang were protected like Obiang's own uncle had protected him. Democracy was nowhere to be found. Black Beach Prison was kept conspicuously open, but now dignitaries from all across Europe, including even the Pope, stopped by from time to time to have their picture taken with a very pleased Teodoro Obiang. He even received direct tutoring in French from the French ambassador himself. For a while, this is exactly how life went in Equatorial Guinea until 1996, when Obiang's government would stumble upon the gift of a lifetime: oil. Unbeknownst to the Spanish, who had left it behind, to the previous dictator, Macias, or to the rest of the world, Equatorial Guinea was sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in all of sub-Saharan Africa. It was the company Mobil that made the find, ExxonMobil today, and when they did, the fortunes of the entire nation pivoted on its collective axis. Or they would have, if this were practically any other nation on Earth. Now, that's not to say that every nation that strikes oil immediately hands its wealth to the residents en masse, far from it, but in Equatorial Guinea, well, this is the moment that the regime earns the title of this video. Faced with an unlikely and quite frankly unbelievable bounty, Obiang and his inner circle set out to create the perfect kleptocracy, a system that would allow Equatorial Guinea to generate incredible revenues and would allow them to funnel those revenues directly to their personal fortunes. Oil production in Equatorial Guinea hit its peak in 2004, and even though production has since dropped off, some 20 years later the country still produces multiple hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day. The companies that are or have been involved in production form a very long list, and one with a few pretty recognizable names: ExxonMobil, Chevron, Marathon, Trident, and more. With just about the entirety of Equatorial Guinea's oil and gas located offshore, these companies are free to drill whatever they like, however they like it, with very little oversight from the Equatorial Guinean government. In exchange, those companies and others from around the world have got to pay up. In a mix of direct investments, royalty payments, and a whole bunch of other murky follow-the-money stuff we're just not going to get into today, Equatorial Guinea pulls in an incredible gross domestic product. In 2005, Equatorial Guinea's GDP per capita placed second in the entire world, coming just behind the global leader Luxembourg. Think of any other country around the world, and per person, Equatorial Guinea was richer. How rich? Well, to the tune of over $50,000 per person for every person in the nation. In that year, well over 400,000 barrels per day were extracted from Equato-Guinean waters. But standing between Equatorial Guinea's incredible oil wealth and its people is Teodoro Obiang and his government. And that barrier is one through which the vast majority of the money cannot pass. One of the Obiang government's most valuable tools to siphon away wealth comes via public infrastructure. Expansive, ambitious infrastructure project proposals are common in Equatorial Guinea, including a planned capital city that's being built at a snail's pace in what was previously an undeveloped forest. Everything from bridges to statues to airports seem to sound like fantastic ideas to the Equato-Guinean regime, but in reality, the money allotted from the national budget for those projects will almost always be awarded to companies that are fully or partially owned by high-ranking officials, including Obiang himself. Most of the projects never end up actually happening, and those that do eventually get built are typically done for a small fraction of the allotted cost. Nor do the completed projects tend to be things like hospitals, schools, or anything else that might go back to the benefit of the Equatorial Guinean people. The regime insists, of course, that there's nothing wrong with this approach and no conflicts of interest to speak of when it comes to their methods of national development. But the money disappears anyway, just as the handful of national elites seem to get richer and richer. Doesn't take a genius to work out what's going on here. But the Obiang government isn't just a corrupt contracting one-trick pony either. The nation's other natural resources, its timber, its fishing industry, and more, are all controlled directly by key government ministers, and by outsourcing to foreign companies who import or hire their own workers, the government is left free to hoard its wealth without having to worry about compensating ordinary people. After all, give ordinary members of the public things like a consistent, sufficient income, and they might be empowered to do troublesome things, like, say, trying to lift up their communities or get the education their rulers so desperately don't want them to have. A majority of the Equato-Guinean workforce still relies on subsistence farming, with most of the rest of the population working in their villages and towns, performing menial or back-breaking work. To say that poverty runs rampant would be an understatement. Further, the country has been plagued internationally with money laundering and corruption scandals, pulling in a range of foreign governments and banks who are investigated as collaborators or for enabling the regime to function as it does. In perhaps Equatorial Guinea's most famous international embarrassment, it was part of a scandal that implicated Washington, D.C.-based Riggs Bank, where Equatorial Guinea kept most of its oil reserves. The trouble was, Riggs Bank had also done quite a bit of banking for longtime Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, and as all that was investigated, the Los Angeles Times dug up quite a bit of evidence around just how many D.C. executives were more than happy to cozy up to a known and brutal dictatorship. Teodoro Obiang himself would spend quite a few nice afternoons sharing lunch with Riggs's chief executive, all while his money was being neatly channeled into Riggs's managed offshore shell corporations. Perhaps by this point, the revelation that Equatorial Guinea is a modern-day criminal state is pretty unsurprising, especially considering how the country's incredible corruption is still somehow so much less awful than the Macias years. And perhaps it even seems unremarkable that Western banks and companies would be glad to cozy up to a dictatorship like this one, all in the interest of profit. But what really stands out where Equatorial Guinea is concerned is the degree to which nations across the globe are not just willing, but they're eager to look past Obiang's transgressions in order to get a piece of the pie. And of all the many nations that have taken Obiang on, none have done it quite so thoroughly as the United States. Just for a bit of perspective on how exactly the US-Equatorial Guinea relationship has gone, the United States closed its embassy in Equatorial Guinea in 1995 after its ambassador had been accused of witchcraft and been threatened over reporting on the human rights environment there. 1 year later, Obiang struck oil, and American companies very quickly started putting down roots. The embassy opened again in 2003. In the following years, Obiang's own son would explain to American journalists just how much the regime appreciated America's tendency to stay out of internal matters. In fact, it's been no secret that in the past American administrations, particularly the George W. Bush years from 2000 to 2008, officials were very reticent to launch any substantive critique toward the nation. Obiang's personal actions didn't just go unaddressed by the United States, especially in recent decades. He's been celebrated, feted at high-profile events and trotted around the UN headquarters in New York on many occasions. All that to celebrate what many US politicians referred to as, quote, the Kuwait of Africa, a highly oil-productive nation that was simply too small and unobtrusive to ever be looked at too closely. Yet, we must be crystal clear here. None of what was going on in Equatorial Guinea was a secret to the nation's international partners, least of all the US. Instead, it's turned out that oil is just as valuable a lubricant for geopolitics as it is for machinery. American Ambassador John Bennett, who had served in Equatorial Guinea during the 1990s, had described to American leadership the marks of brutal torture that prisoners often showed when coming in for their show trials, hands stretched and deformed so badly that they were functionally useless. They had mutilations to their faces, and there were men who had described excruciating electrical torture applied to their genitals. Said another prior ambassador, Frank Ruddy, who served there in the 1980s, quote, I was talking with somebody over at the State Department whom I knew, a person who worked with me when I was over there, who was with the State Department and had a position in Equatorial Guinea. He told me our people could hear the screams of torture from some of these places. Yet these sorts of troubling observations didn't matter much. In 2004, US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice welcomed Obiang to Washington, in which he was personally recognized at a black tie dinner where Rice's own address included gems like, and we're quoting here, Americans must never excuse tyranny or corruption in Africa. Also in 2004, the US State Department would state in a human rights report on the country, quote, senior government officials told foreign diplomats during the year that human rights do not apply to criminals and that torture of known criminals was not a human rights abuse. Bennett himself attested to having received death threats during his time in the country after having described his situation to the State Department directly. And lest you believe this is just a 2000s problem, rest assured it takes only a quick Google search to see Obiang in the White House with Barack Obama, or a long line of American delegations and diplomats lining up to kiss the ring in visits to the country. And by no means do we intend to only pick on America here. When in the mid-2000s, the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade was asked about its own support for businesses involved in Equatorial Guinea, a spokesman responded, quote, the specific situation of human rights in Equatorial Guinea, while leaving a lot to be desired, is improving. And later, the embassy has never missed an opportunity to make representations with the authorities of Equatorial Guinea in respect to these issues. Those claims, despite the fact that at that time Canada didn't even have an embassy in the country and today relies on its embassy all the way in Nigeria to serve in Equatorial Guinean matters. France, for its part, has been active in its courtship of Obiang, and although that relationship has gotten more contentious in recent years, it's only after decades in which France has welcomed the dictatorship to a network of francophone nations in Africa. Britain, Russia, China, and a range of other powerful nations have each had their own complex histories with Equatorial Guinea, with China currently serving as the nation's foremost goods importer and Xi Jinping himself frequently lauding praise onto Obiang in exchange for the nation's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. Portugal, China, Poland, Brazil, North Korea have all poured resources into the planned capital city, which was started over a decade ago with the intent to house hundreds of thousands of people, but currently is home to just 2,000. Now, we can't completely condemn the international community's embrace of Obiang because, to some of their credit, they've also tried to have the guy overthrown. Over the past 40-plus years, Teodoro Obiang has shown himself to be remarkably coup-proof, but easily the most notable attempt to depose him was one that came in 2004, best known as the Wonga coup. The plot was organised by powerful international backers, mostly British ones, including one Sir Mark Thatcher, son of longtime Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But it went down, allegedly, under the direction of one Simon Mann, an ex-commando in the British Special Air Service who has since co-founded the mercenary organisation Sandline International. Mann, plus a group of several dozen mercenaries comprising mostly veterans from a pro-apartheid South African Special Forces unit, allegedly orchestrated a plot to infiltrate Equatorial Guinea with a small team of 14, take over an airport, allow a much larger mercenary force to arrive, overthrow Obiang, and install exiled Equatorial Guinean opposition leader Severo Moto. Moto, by the way, has made frequent allegations that, among other things, Obiang is a cannibal who's taken to eating the testicles of his victims. Unfortunately, the plot didn't go well for anybody involved. A range of rather high-profile Brits were implicated in the scheme, and while both the US and the UK governments were allegedly told of the coup attempt, including a full and complete rundown presented to the British, there was no known action taken to prevent the coup from going down. Spain, too, was accused of participating, as the nation apparently had 2 warships off the Equatorial Guinean coast when the coup was attempted. Instead, 70 of the coup plotters were arrested and had their Boeing 727 seized as they travelled through Zimbabwe, and 8 others were detained inside Equatorial Guinea. The alleged coup leader, Simon Mann, would later be extradited to Equatorial Guinea and kept for months in Black Beach Prison. He was released, lucky for him, in 2009 and allowed to return to Britain. According to Equatorial Guinea, another group of armed mercenaries was intercepted trying to overthrow Obiang in late 2017, with these fighters being allegedly recruited from Chad, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. International actors have proven to be both unwilling and at times demonstrably unable to get Obiang out of power. With nobody left inside Equatorial Guinea with the means to remove him except those in his inner circle who benefit from his rule directly, Obiang is free to govern as he sees fit. And unsurprisingly, the vision he's developed for his nation leaves exceptionally little room for anyone other than his own closest affiliates to do anything of consequence. Those who run the country now form a cabal that nearly exclusively comprises Obiang's own relatives. Not only is nepotism the most reliable way to become a person of real consequence in the country, but it is the only way to do so. And in a system so thoroughly broken, so internationally exploitative as Obiang's, the most surefire way to maintain the government's hold on power is to ensure that no other Equatorial Guinean stands a chance at ever even getting close. In this particular country, the way to accomplish that task is via neglect. Across the largely impoverished population, modern health services are scarce and aren't sought out by national authorities. As recently as 2015, only a quarter of Equatorial Guinean infants were immunized for polio and measles, and an only slightly higher proportion were vaccinated for tuberculosis. Those who survive face a life expectancy still in the early 60s, searching for treatment from the country's one physician for every 2,500 people. Clean drinking water and proper sanitation are by no means guaranteed, especially in rural areas, while malaria, typhoid fever, rabies, and sexually transmitted diseases are common. When it comes to education, the system isn't much better. Despite mandatory education for children through the age of 11, barely half of the country's schooling-age population actually attends classes, far behind the standard across Africa. Of the children who do begin their education, just 1 in 4 will go so far as to attend middle school, a long-lasting after effect of the Macias era's vilification of intellectualism. While early schooling does give the population a high literacy rate, over 95%, that figure doesn't tell nearly the whole story, and it's trumpeted proudly by the regime as justification for not investing further into its citizens. According to the International Monetary Fund, the nation took in about $4 billion of revenue each year in the early 2010s, but spent, at best, roughly $230 million on health and education combined. And that's in a country that desperately needs help in both. That's 3 cents on every dollar Equatorial Guinea makes, as opposed to 80 cents of each dollar allotted to infrastructure projects, placing the country at the absolute bottom of the list when it comes to per dollar education and health spending in Africa. Outside the oil industry, which itself is dominated by foreign workers living in company towns, there is practically no remaining room in the national economy for people to find work. Or should we say, they can find work as subsistence farmers or by providing a service in their village or town, but that's where it ends. Unemployment is through the roof, especially among the younger population, and with well over half of Equatorial Guineans under age 25, that is a growing problem as more working-age people come into a system with no work available. A young person can try to join the military, but that's both a rare opportunity and a risky proposition. Just as recently as 2021, a massive explosion of improperly stored dynamite on a military base killed at least 107 people and injured over 600. Rural Equatorial Guineans who travel to find work in urban areas have it no better. With too many people in need of employment, most people are stuck in a race to the bottom, trying to scrape by doing menial work with hardly any compensation. Because, as they know too well, somebody's always willing to do the same work for less. But Equatorial Guinea's efforts to keep its people down go a long way beyond just passive neglect, largely through attempts to restrict information access as completely as possible. This is not a country with a long or comprehensive list of banned books. This is a place where bookstores are simply not allowed to exist. The national radio station is owned by Obiang's son. The available television is exclusively comprised of state-owned media, and a person found to be an independent journalist without the credible support of a respected government might as well consider themselves incarcerated from the moment they're found out. Many people do have internet access in their areas, but Equatorial Guineans generally lack the means to actually get online, and while those who do connect to the internet are able to explore around a relatively limited set of firewalls, people online are forced to self-censor on the web just like they would in everyday conversations. Mounting a criticism of the government of Obiang or of the national state of affairs in public or private is still simply too much of a risk. And as outside information is shut out, state propaganda takes its place, particularly a new generation personality cult around Obiang that resembles the one constructed for his predecessor. In 2003, the state-owned radio service declared that Obiang was, quote, the country's god, with, again quoting, all power over men and things. They also claimed that he can, quoting again, decide to kill without anyone calling him to account and without going to hell. His redesigns to Equatorial Guinea's cities and towns have frequently included streets named in honor of his 1979 coup, and in his own country, shirts bearing his face are both popular among the people and ubiquitous in national clothing shops. Obiang's 2003 decision to take full control of the national treasury was explained away by state media as an effort to prevent corruption by local public servants. His decision to categorically reject stepping down at any point has been treated with admiration and gravitas rather than dismay. And finally, there's one more crushing layer of exploitation levied against the people of Equatorial Guinea, and that's human trafficking. As of 2023, Equatorial Guinea has never once convicted a human trafficker under a 2004 law passed to curtail the issue. Instead, senior government officials are understood to be directly complicit in massive levels of trafficking and exploitation, both against locals and foreigners at home and Equatorial Guineans abroad. The ordeals that trafficked Equatorial Guineans might face are wide-ranging. Some are forced into domestic servitude and sex trafficking in the country's two big cities, while others are forced to work for nothing in the national service industry. Children in the countryside are intermittently pressed into forced labor, while others are recruited with promises of attending schools abroad before instead being shipped off to places where they're expected to work as students. Still other Equatorial Guineans are sex trafficked in Spain, while people from other African and Latin American nations are trafficked into Equatorial Guinea and forced into servitude there. In the face of yet another systemic issue, the national government has not lifted a finger to intervene and quite obviously has no intention to do so in the future. Now, as we reflect on the incredibly bleak situation of Equatorial Guinea, we're left searching for a bit of hope, some small indicator that perhaps the future of this broken nation won't quite be so horrific as its past. Unfortunately, there's very little good news to offer here, and plenty of evidence that things really won't be getting better anytime soon. As it exists now, in 2024, Equatorial Guinea is reeling from the aftershocks of a difficult few years. As you can probably imagine, government support was nearly absent, and good information was hard to find during the pandemic years, and the ongoing war in Ukraine has meant that the country's food exports have been slow to find their way to Equatorial Guinea, where 4/5 of the food comes from abroad. It had recent outbreaks of the deadly Marburg virus, including one in 2023, where every probable case, 23 in total, ended up in death. More pressing regional conflicts and intrigue, competition between major powers in Africa, and the consistently unassuming international profile of Equatorial Guinea have all served to prevent this particular nation from ending up in the global spotlight. And making matters worse, the ruling elite is by now well aware that it's living on borrowed time. Equatorial Guinea's oil reserves are now 2 decades past their peak, and they're expected to run totally dry by 2035. Just a couple of years ago, ExxonMobil announced that it intended to pull out of the country in 2026 when its current oil production license expires, not because of anything the Obiang government is involved in, of course, but because it no longer makes sense to keep up operations to harvest oil that's about to be gone. Even now, ExxonMobil's oil production has dipped under 15,000 barrels a day in the country, and its offshore oil rigs, now old to the point of falling apart, are too expensive to fix up. Equatorial Guinea only recently joined OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, but like the rest of Africa, it appears unlikely to be able to hit its quotas in the coming years. Global oil companies are quickly pulling up stakes from most of the continent, and unless Equatorial Guinea can find some new reserves, they're not going to be coming back. By the time Equatorial Guinea's well does hit empty, Teodoro Obiang likely won't be around. At the time of writing, Obiang is aged 81, meaning that questions of succession are more important now than they've ever been. In a country with such a small, ultra-powerful elite, there's plenty of potential for palace intrigue to spiral rapidly out of control, especially as political competitors also stand to gain great wealth from each other's personal fortunes if they can exploit a change in leadership just right. But as of now, one clear successor has emerged above the others: Meet Teodoro Ngema Obiang Mangwe, son of the current dictator, who, because of the substantial overlap between his name and his father's, we're going to refer to by a common nickname, Teodorin. Currently 55, Teodorin grew up under his father's rule in Equatorial Guinea, although he's still old enough to remember the Macias era in his youth. Educated at a prestigious French private school, Teodorin is the very image of a well-to-do, Western-educated son of a dictator. In his days as a young adult, he lived out of California's Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills while attending Pepperdine University, where he was encouraged to drop out after a few months due to lack of attendance. Upon returning to Equatorial Guinea, he rose through the Nepo baby ranks of his father's government, first as a presidential advisor, then as Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, then as second vice president, sort of a vice-vice president position, and now as first vice president. He's been his father's heir designate for decades now, and he oversees defense and security matters to the extent that he or anyone else in the country's elite fulfill a governing role at all. Outside of his position at home, Teodorin has gained precisely the international image you might expect as an ultra-rich adherent to the principles of fast living and incredible luxury. In the early 2000s, Teodorin distinguished himself through his loyalty to the Lamborghini brand and his affinity for Hollywood and Rio, and through his well-developed tendency to blow through incredible amounts of money in the span of a couple of days. He's owned a $31 million compound in Malibu, a massive home in a rich area of Paris, several very, very rare sports cars, a whole lot of watches worth tens of millions at a minimum, and apparently an ungodly amount of Michael Jackson memorabilia. All the while, he's been a frequent target of asset seizures, corruption investigations, and fiscal rulings that have stripped many of those assets away. But with so much wealth to fall back on, Teodorin seems utterly unbothered by those sorts of prosecutions, and if you don't believe us, check out his Instagram. If one thing is clear, it's that Teodorin is not a reformer by any means. This is a man who made headlines as recently as 2023 when he had a super yacht and 2 palaces in South Africa seized as penalty for an incident 10 years prior that saw him capture and imprison a South African businessman for 2 years in Black Beach Prison. He's widely understood to have the loyalty of many Equatorial Guinean elites and politicians, and he's been the agreed-upon choice to succeed his father for a long time. He's got his internal rivalries, to be sure. His uncle, Armengol Ondo Ngema, is head of President Obiang's Israeli-trained security detail and apparently detests the idea of Teodorin's succession. Armengol is nowhere near a savory figure himself. He, like Teodorin, is believed to be more than happy to commit human rights abuses in his own country while holding estates and property abroad, including in the US. But Teodorin seems to have gotten the better of his spats with his uncle, largely owing to his uncle's likely links to that 2004 coup d'etat attempt that we mentioned earlier. In all likelihood, it's Teodorin who will be in control of his nation when the oil companies pull out of Equatorial Guinea for good. When they leave, the nation's future will be entirely unclear. With limited natural resources, a population that the government has shown no interest in organizing for larger-scale industry, and a completely aloof ruling cabal at its helm, the country promises to be one of the most unique, if repressive, 21st century nations on Earth. It's unlikely that the Teodorin government would just pull up stakes and leave Equatorial Guinea anytime soon. After all, the ruling class is believed to have an incredible fortune at its disposal, enough to sustain it for many generations if used wisely. But nowhere in the ruling class's modus operandi is an interest in using any real portion of that wealth for the benefit of the rest of the country. Sadly, we must conclude today's video without much hope at all toward Equatorial Guinea's future. With the country so thoroughly gutted of a proper government that its current leaders and their children could spend centuries ruling with impunity, there is little hope of either an internal or an external change that could upset Equatorial Guinea's status quo. With the oil gone, it's not unthinkable that the country's rulers could push its labor force into a number of other initiatives. But if one thing is consistent across 5.5 decades of Equatorial Guinean rule, it's that no action shall be taken that might see wealth shared with anyone but a select few. That, it seems, is just as anathema to future President Teodorin as it was to his father or to his great-uncle. But at its core, that's the point of the kleptocracy that is Equatorial Guinea. Over half a century, one extended family has taken control of so much of their nation that they are inseparable from its very nature. In their own land, they rule with complete authority, following laws of their choosing and throwing those laws away as they see fit. In a world with so many authoritarian rulers that in their darkest corners might aspire to be like Obiang and Teodorin, it's all the more important to pull back the curtain on Equatorial Guinea. After all, Equatorial Guinea is the end game when it comes to dictatorship, a totalitarian nation beaten into submission, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that now nobody can stop. Whether Equatorial Guinea's future will be brighter than its present and past, well, we suspect that by now you're probably just as pessimistic as we are. But the international community has been wrong before about this sort of thing, however rarely, and we will certainly be wrong again. So let's hope that somehow, some way, we end up being wrong this time.